he was born far from the Himalayas, far from any snow-capped horizon or thin-air wilderness. On December 19, 1955, in Canberra, Australia, Lincoln Ross Hall entered a world that had no idea what he would later attempt. But from the beginning he carried within him a kind of quiet restlessness, a curiosity that lived just under the skin, a desire to know what waited beyond the familiar. As a child, Lincoln wasn't loud or combative. He was observant. He noticed details, the way ridgelines curved, how stones felt different under his hands, how wind could change a landscape's mood in seconds. When he discovered climbing in his teenage years, something clicked into place. He sensed intuitively that the vertical world spoke a language he understood. The rock didn't need to explain itself. It simply demanded effort, attention, and honesty. That was enough. By the time he was 15, climbing wasn't a hobby for Lincoln. It was an identity forming in real time. The granite of Australia's local crags became his classroom. He spent afternoons scrambling up the walls of Borumba rocks, learning with each move what his body could do and, more importantly, what it couldn't. And even when he enrolled at the Australian National University to study zoology, that restless pull toward the mountains never loosened. In lecture halls, while others copied notes, he often found his mind drifting upward, toward cliffs, storms, unseen summits. His friends noticed it too. Lincoln wasn't reckless, but he was driven. When he spoke about far-off mountain ranges, his tone changed. He sounded more alive. The ANU Climbing Club was where everything escalated. What began as weekend climbs slowly matured into an ambition that none of them had yet dared to say aloud: the Himalayas. In 1978, when a group of them set out for the 7,066-meter peak of Dunagiri in India, they were young, inexperienced by Himalayan standards, and maybe a little naive, but they were hungry. The expedition wasn't gentle with them. Dunagiri was a cold, merciless tutor. Lincoln suffered frostbite so severe that he lost toes. The summit slipped away from him, denied by altitude and weather. But failure did not sour him. It defined him. Dunagiri taught Hall a lesson many climbers never learn early enough. Mountains don't care who you are. They don't reward desire. They reward discipline, judgment, and respect. And if you lack any of those, they take something from you. A piece of your strength, a piece of your safety, or, if you are unlucky, a piece of your life. Lincoln returned from the Himalayas, changed but unbroken. He understood now that the world's great peaks weren't simply challenges, they were teachers. And he wanted to learn more. Throughout the early 1980 seconds, Hall climbed wherever he could: Antarctica, the Andes, remote Himalayan valleys, hidden ridges across Asia. Each summit, each expedition added another layer to the man he was becoming. A climber who understood risk, who accepted consequence, who valued the process as much as the goal. Then came 1984, a year that pushed him to the limits of who he was and who he believed he might become. Australia mounted a bold Everest expedition, a team attempting the unclimbed North Face without bottled oxygen. It was the kind of attempt people whispered about, a feat bordering on absurd, a challenge soaked in danger. But that was precisely what made it irresistible. Lincoln Hall joined the team. The expedition was brutal, demanding, and astonishingly ambitious. Together they carved a new route up the North Face, the first Australians to leave their mark on Everest in that way. Lincoln climbed high, incredibly high, just below the summit, only a few hundred meters from standing on the world's roof. But a storm and failing health forced him to turn back. Many climbers would have been haunted by such a near miss, but Lincoln wasn't tormented, he was humbled. He understood that Everest wasn't a mountain to be conquered. It was a mountain you were permitted to stand on only if circumstances aligned perfectly. And even then, only temporarily. He wrote about these experiences in articles, essays, and later books. His voice, soft, thoughtful, almost philosophical, resonated with people. He wasn't trying to be a hero, he was trying to understand himself through climbing. And along the way, he became one of Australia's most respected mountaineers. But Lincoln's purpose wasn't limited to peaks. With others, he co-founded the Australian Himalayan Foundation, aiming to support education and health in remote mountain communities. He recognized that climbers often use the Himalayas as playgrounds, rarely giving back. He refused to be that kind of climber, For him, the mountains were not trophies. They were homes to people with needs greater than his own. Still, Everest lingered, a quiet echo in the back of his mind. The mountain he had approached, touched, but never stood upon. Life moved forward. He gained a family. He wrote. He worked. And yet, Everest remained unfinished business. By 2006, Lincoln Hall was 50 years old, older than many high-altitude climbers who still pushed into the death zone. But Lincoln was not the average man on the mountain. He had decades of experience, a lifetime of technical judgment, and a deep understanding of danger. He wasn't chasing glory. He was completing a chapter left open too long. When he joined the 2006 Everest expedition on the north side, he did so quietly. No fanfare, no drama. He wasn't the strongest climber on the team nor the youngest, but he was the one who carried the most history. The mountain knew his face, and he knew its moods. As he prepared for the ascent, something inside him felt settled, almost calm. He had failed to reach the summit before, but he no longer feared failure. He feared only leaving something unsaid, something incomplete within himself. The climb began. The days passed. Camps rose and fell behind them. The thin air sharpened thought, then blurred it. The winds interrogated every choice. Everest does not let you climb it without taking something from you. Strength, time, comfort, clarity. But on May 25, 2006, Lincoln Hall stepped onto the summit. After decades of dreaming, of trying, of retreating and returning, he finally stood where the earth ends. What he could not know, what no one on that ridge could imagine, was that the descent would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories in mountaineering history. The kind of story climbers whisper about for decades. The kind of story that defies logic, breaks rules, and leaves the world stunned. The summit of Everest is a strange place. It is not triumphant, not celebratory, not even joyful. It is quiet, a thin, almost ghost-like quiet, pressed beneath the weight of the sky. Lincoln Hall stood there on May 25, 2006, taking it in. After decades of climbing, after injuries, setbacks, and close calls, he had finally reached the top. But the summit was only a pause in the story, a brief exhale before everything turned. His descent began smoothly enough. He was tired, certainly, and moving slower than his teammates, but that was common for climbers his age. At over 8,000 meters, even the strongest bodies wander toward the edge of what is humanly possible. Every breath feels borrowed. Every step feels uncertain. But somewhere below the summit ridge, something shifted inside Lincoln's mind. Subtle at first, a slip of clarity, then another. Suddenly his thoughts seemed to stretch and bend in ways he couldn't control. The world tilted. A thin ribbon of confusion tightened around his awareness. High-altitude cerebral edema is a thief, silent, merciless, and fast. It steals reason, it steals judgment, it steals the ability to recognize danger, even as danger presses closer. Lincoln began hallucinating. He spoke nonsensically. He tried removing his gloves, tugging at his jacket, acting as if he were too warm, an ominous sign at nearly 8,700 meters. His Sherpa guides tried desperately to move him downward, supporting his weight, coaxing him step by step. But time was slipping away. Their oxygen was running low. Snow blindness began to set in. The wind rose, dragging their strength with it. Eventually, after hours of struggling, the expedition leader made a brutal decision, the kind no one ever wants to make, but sometimes must. Lincoln Hall was pronounced dead. He was left on the mountain. Messages were sent down to base camp. Lincoln is gone. His family was informed. His teammates mourned quietly, stunned but not entirely surprised. Everest claims lives every year. The mountain had simply taken its due. But Everest had not finished with Lincoln Hall. 12 hours later, as the sun rose over the northeast ridge, another climbing team was ascending, a group led by Daniel Mazur, with climbers Andrew Brash, Miles Osborne, and Jangbu Sherpa. They expected a normal morning, a normal climb. What they found instead was something so improbable that, at first, they doubted their own senses. Just below the second step, on a narrow ledge overlooking a 3,000-meter drop, a man sat cross-legged. Jacket unzipped, arms bare. No gloves, no oxygen, no goggles, no hat, no sleeping bag, no rope, no pack. no protection against the killing cold. And he was alive. "I imagine you're surprised to see me here," he said calmly. The climbers froze. For a heartbeat, none of them spoke. They stared at the man, exhausted, frostbitten, impossibly lucid. A human being who should have been long dead. The shock was overwhelming. Even at sea level, it would have been unbelievable. Up there, in the death zone, where thought becomes thick and slow, it felt like witnessing a miracle with no script. Miles Osborne later described the moment vividly. He didn't look like a ghost. He didn't look like a dying man. He looked like someone waiting for a bus, and yet his condition was critical. He was dehydrated, disoriented, suffering from severe cerebral edema. Without immediate help, he would die within minutes. The team faced a brutal choice: continue to the summit, their once-in-a-lifetime chance, or abandon everything and attempt a rescue almost certain to fail. But to them, it wasn't truly a choice. They unclipped from the fixed lines and moved toward him. The summit could wait. A human life could not. They wrapped Lincoln in spare clothing, fed him oxygen, tried to warm his frozen extremities. It wasn't enough, not in the death zone, but it was all they had. They spoke to him constantly, trying to keep him awake, trying to keep him anchored to reality. Meanwhile, word spread down the mountain like electricity. The team's Sherpas started climbing upward, an unprecedented rescue push involving 12 elite Sherpas ascending from far below. No one had attempted a rescue of this scale, at this altitude, with a man who had already been declared dead. Lincoln somehow walked part of the way. Part of the way he was carried. Part of the way he was dragged, supported, steadied, held up by the combined will of people refusing to let him die again. Hour by hour they descended, and hour by hour the miracle thickened. Lincoln Hall was alive, or perhaps more accurately, refusing to stop living. By the time he reached the North Colonel, he was severely frostbitten, weak, and barely conscious, but undeniably alive. A Russian doctor treated him, stabilizing him just enough for further descent. When he finally reached advanced base camp, climbers gathered around him in disbelief. Some whispered, some shook their heads, some simply stared. The mountain had returned what it had taken, something Everest almost never does. News broke around the world. Climber found alive after being left for dead on Everest. Headlines spread like wildfire. Lincoln's family, who had been grieving only hours earlier, received the news with a mix of shock, relief, and confusion. In the days that followed, Lincoln regained clarity. He remembered fragments, dreamlike visions, flashes of hallucination, pieces of dialogue that seemed to float in the thin air. He remembered hearing voices and thinking they were part of a dream. He remembered feeling warm when he should have been freezing. He remembered letting go. And then waking up. The frostbite cost him the tips of several fingers and a toe. But these were small prices for a life returned. The climbing community responded with awe, but also with controversy. Only days earlier, another climber, David Sharp, had died alone on the mountain while dozens of climbers passed by. Why had Lincoln been saved while others were not? Should more have been done for Sharp? What moral obligations do climbers have in the death zone? Sir Edmund Hillary himself spoke critically of the culture on Everest. But rescue workers pointed out something painful. David Sharp had been unconscious and unable to move. Lincoln Hall, by contrast, was awake, able to respond, even able to walk at times. In the death zone, those differences mean everything. Lincoln, however, had no anger, no bitterness, no desire to fuel controversy. He simply felt gratitude to the Sherpas, to Dan Mazur's team, to the world that had given him a second dawn. He returned home to Australia, to his wife, his sons, and a quiet house in the Blue Mountains. He wrote about the experience in his book, Dead Lucky, a title that captured the absurdity and fragility of what had happened. Documentaries followed, interviews, waves of astonished climbers wanting to hear the story from the only man who could tell it. But time, as it always does, continued forward. In 2012, after a long fight against mesothelioma, Lincoln Hall passed away at the age of 56. Not on an icy ridge, not in the howling dark of the death zone, but peacefully, in a hospital room, surrounded by love. His friend Greg Mortimer said, he slipped away quietly, as if breathing with the rhythm of a mountain. Lincoln Hall lived a life defined not by summits but by resilience. He is remembered not simply as the man who survived the impossible, but as someone who understood deeply, that mountains are never just mountains. They are mirrors. They force us to confront our limits, our fears, our decisions, and the truth of who we are when the air thins and the world narrows to a single step. And in that thin, fragile space between life and death, Lincoln Hall stepped forward and somehow came back.